Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's panel on the economic effects of COVID-19, presented by the Colgate Economics Club. We're thrilled to have our panelists and all of you joining us virtually this mildly cold evening. Before we go ahead and introduce our wonderful team of panelists tonight, we would just like to run through the format of our panel today. So, following the introductions, we'll have each panelist will have 4 to 5 minutes to present opening remarks and discuss what, according to them, have been interesting trends or economic insights of interest to have emerged following either the COVID-19 pandemic or the associated economic recovery we've seen so far. We'll then have a brief 10 to 5 minute, 15-minute moderated discussion with our panelists, following which we'll open up the floor for any Q&A by the audience. Just as a note for all of you joining us today, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your webinar screen. So feel free to send us your questions, and we hope and we'll attempt to get through as many of them as we can towards the end. And so, without further ado, we have with us today Professor Higgins, who is a macroeconomist with research interests that are both theoretical and empirical. This semester, he's teaching advanced macroeconomics, while his teaching interests generally include courses in monetary policy, banking, and intermediate macroeconomics. He also serves as the faculty advisor for Colgate's Fetch Talent team, which Matt and I both have been very honored to have taken in the past. We're very glad to have Professor Higgins on the panel here today. We also have with us Professor Murphy, who is an empirical researcher whose work is grounded in microeconomic theory. His research interests span development, social capital, agriculture, experimental economics, among many other areas. Currently, he's teaching Intro to Econ and Economic Development. Professor Murphy, with his field experience and research, is a perfect fit for the panel in helping us better discover how and what COVID recovery has meant for developing countries, agriculture, and development generally. I'm very thrilled to have Professor Murphy on the panel today.
Tonight, we also have Professor Scrimgeour. Professor Scrimgeour is a macroeconomist specializing in monetary policy and economic growth. Professor Scrimgeour is currently teaching 2 sections of intermediate macroeconomics. Outside the classroom, you can find Professor Scrimgeour on Fred, looking for the next great chart to show his class. We're absolutely thrilled to have you today. In addition to Professor Scrimgeour, today we are joined by Professor Sharma. Professor Sharma specializes in international trade and public finance. This semester, he's teaching a seminar on international trade. If you have any questions you'd like to ask about COVID economic recovery in terms of international trade, please send them to Professor Sharma. Back in freshman year, Professor Sharma was my intro to economics professor, and he got me hooked on the subject. So I'm so honored to introduce you to tonight's panel. And finally, we have Professor Song. Professor Song specializes in educational economics and Chinese economics. This semester, Professor Song is teaching 2 sections of economics of education seminar. Outside the classroom, Professor Song is also a board member of the Chinese Education Finance Policy Association and my advisor. I'm thrilled to have Professor Song and hear her insights on the Chinese economy. With that said, we'd love to pass it off to Professor Higgins to give an introduction.
All right, well, thank you, Sahil and Matt, for organizing this and for having me be part of the panel. I'm going to start off by talking about GDP. And basically, I just want to talk a little bit about comparing this recession to the Great Recession, because there are some similarities, but there are a lot of differences as well. So basically what we have here, so the orange dashed line in the graph is going to show you a trend line. So basically, this is from the early 90s until the end of 2006. And it's just a line fit between those 2 points. And the thing that we can see pretty clearly is that there is a sharp decline in output during the Great Recession, and then we essentially never recovered from that. And so there was a long, slow recovery. And what we see during the COVID recession is that there's a really sharp decline, and then the economy bounces back part way, but not all of the way. And so, I think one of the things for us to think about is that is whether there are going to be sort of longer term effects from this recession, like what we saw during the Great Recession. And I think that there are reasons that we might think that could happen, but there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic. So one of the reasons to be optimistic is that before COVID, the economy may not have been doing great, but it wasn't doing poorly. There weren't any sort of glaring signs like there were in 2007, in 2019, 2020. And so, there's a sort of a hope that once we get more people vaccinated, that the economy should recover quite quickly. There are a lot of people that have sort of money that's burning a hole in their pockets, essentially. There's been a lot of fiscal support, monetary support, and so there's some reason for optimism. There's also some reason for pessimism that even if we can get COVID under control by the end of the year, that maybe some people's habits have changed, and there might be permanent changes due to that. There was a paper that was presented at the Jackson Hole Symposium last year by Laura Veldkamp that also pointed out that these sort of tail events like we see during the Great Recession and during the COVID crisis might change people's beliefs permanently. So if you think about someone that's making a decision about whether they want to open a restaurant, they're now going to be thinking that there is some probability that I may have to shut down this restaurant because of a pandemic. Whereas if you ask someone in 2015 whether they would have to shut down the restaurant because of a pandemic, they probably wouldn't be thinking about that. And so that may change people's behavior, and that may cause people to be less willing to invest. And so these are just things for us to think about going forward. And so I'll pass it off to Professor Scrimgeour.
All right, I just wanted to say a couple things to kick things off here from my perspective. And there have been all sorts of really amazing, sudden changes in the economy in the last year. Rich talked about some of them just now. And here's a graph that I put together that shows the personal savings rate over the last 60 years. So this is for households, essentially looking at their disposable income and what of that disposable income they're not spending at any point as a share of their overall income. And you can see that hovers around 10% in the 60s and 70s, then kind of comes down lower and lower, getting close to zero around 2000. And then in the last year, just shot up, right? This really pronounced increase, up to 30% in one period there, and even in the period since that one peak, it's still stayed pretty high. And what's going on there is a combination of two things, right? It's a combination of actually higher income than usual for households, and also lower spending. And a lot of what's going on in the pandemic from the perspective of households is reflected in that, right? Fewer opportunities to go out and spend money, going to the movies or taking a vacation or going to a restaurant. Like those are a lot of things that people have cut back on a lot. And there's also been surprisingly big increases in incomes for households in this period. Normally we think of a recession as a time when incomes are low, but this has actually been a time when, for households at least, incomes have been high. So even though GDP overall is down, we've had these major fiscal stimulus packages that have sent a lot of money out to households, supplemental payments for unemployment insurance that have boosted household income well above what we would normally expect. So that's kind of interesting. I think one of the things that I was thinking about as I was thinking about this webinar that we have here in advance is how much macroeconomic policy can be like fighting the last war. And certainly I think that we can all agree that this has been a very different experience from other recessions. But it seems like a lot of the instincts for policy responses at first are, like what would we do normally? We would use fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus to try and boost the economy. And I mean, maybe those tools have been fine, but the fundamental problem here isn't really addressed by those kinds of tools. And so I think that's just kind of an interesting thing to observe here. So I've got plenty more to say if we get back to me, but I'll shut up now and pass it on to somebody else here.
Professor Sharma, you want to take the floor?
Yeah, thank you. Uh, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about, especially speculating about some of the longer term effects of the pandemic. I want to talk a little bit about automation. So automation in general refers to a process by which machines or computers are substituting for tasks that are currently performed by workers. And there's reason to believe that automation is difficult to measure even under the best of circumstances, certainly quite difficult to measure for something so recent, but based on anecdotal evidence and some survey of firms, there's reason to believe that generally firms have been more willing to invest in automation than in the past as a result of COVID. So this survey by Bain and consultancy asks 500 firms, what were the barriers preventing you from investing in automation and how have these changed? And so we can see kind of across the list of items here that firms report that, these things, all the barriers, in some sense, fewer fraction of firms report each of these barriers. And like with a lot of things about COVID, I mean, some of this might be short-lived, but there's also reason to think, especially looking at some of these items, I see especially something like lack of centralized coordination, IT department not able to support, even something like executive leadership not supportive. A lot of these things seem like organizational changes that once you make some of these changes, it's not going to be all completely reversed. And so, there's often fixed costs in terms of monetary fixed costs, but also in terms of time and learning, and even just kind of a psychological fixed costs of sorts in terms of kind of a willingness to adopt new technologies. And the pandemic sort of forced people to do this in a way that they probably wouldn't have otherwise, or at least not as soon. And automation is something that's economists have long been interested in, especially because of its distributional consequences. If you have something that required 10 workers and now you can do it with 5 workers and a few machines, that's likely to lead to reduced labor demand and act as a downward pressure on wages. And a lot of those concerns are just increased in light of new potential technologies, especially connected to artificial intelligence. And even from a more global distributional perspective, not all countries are likely to be affected by these new technologies in the same way. For a lot of developing countries that sort of historically, many countries relied on labor-intensive manufacturing as their strategy for growth and poverty reduction. Increased automation at some point can also reduce the scope for that kind of activity being cost-effective. And obviously the actual technologies associated with automation tend to be concentrated in a relatively smaller number of countries. So US with things like artificial intelligence, China increasingly, and maybe Germany, Japan produce a lot of robotics. But it's certainly not something that's distributed equally across countries. So I think that this is something where, at this stage, it's kind of speculative, but a lot of reason to believe that COVID might have some long-term implication in accelerating some of the pre-existing trends that that people have been looking at, possibly concerned about. Okay, so yes, I'm happy to talk more about this also, but I'll leave it to whoever's next.
Okay, so let me share mine here. So hopefully everyone can see that. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, thanks to the Economics Club for hosting this. Great to be here. So I'm just going to give a really quick developing country perspective of the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in many respects, the effect on developing countries has been similar to the effect on developed countries. There's been a large decline in GDP growth in 2020. So this graph is showing those declines in GDP growth across many different countries, along with other factors that are going to lead towards greater vulnerability of countries to a long recovery of COVID-19. So you can see many different countries here, some developed, some developing, and kind of the couple at the top, Philippines and India. They seem like they're going to especially struggle in particular to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic economically. So the question then is, what is the difference, like in particular with developing countries? And I find that the biggest difference is what is the fiscal support that the countries are able to provide to their economies. So if you look at for advanced economies on average across the world, they've spent about 7.9% of their 2020 GDP on fiscal support. On the other hand, low income countries, about 1.4%. So significantly less. And why is that? Why are they able to spend so much less? Well, one reason is that developing countries, and this is a graph of sub-Saharan Africa in particular, they have a large amount of external debt. So just looking here at sub-Saharan Africa, the amount of external debt has almost tripled between 2009 and 2019. So developing countries' capacity to spend on fiscal support is lower. And that's a problem because there's been a growth in extreme poverty levels due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So here, this is a table from the Brookings Institute. So the top row there is pre-COVID estimates for decline in extreme poverty in the world. And you can see that between 2019 and 2030, there was an expectation that high levels of poverty or extreme income poverty would decline over that time. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see extreme income poverty increase globally from 8.4 to 9.9% between 2019 and 2020. And there's still projected to be a decline, but it's going to be slower and there'll still be an elevated rate relative to where we would be if there was no COVID-19 pandemic. You can see the same data here for some select countries. You can see India in particular, there's a very large increase in the absolute number of people who are in extreme income poverty. So one policy area that's been really concerning in developing countries is with regard to education. So many developing countries, just like developed countries like the United States, have closed schools or moved to some alternative forms of education rather than in-person schooling. But the options are more limited in developing countries. Internet access is less available. There's less access to laptops or tablets. So because of that, the closure of schools is having a much more significant impact on current education and by extension then future livelihoods of those children. And where are we going in the long run? Well, it's going to be difficult for developing countries because they're going to have to wait for widespread vaccination. So you can see here this map of the world, and it zooms in on Africa in particular. There's not going to be widespread vaccination against COVID-19 probably until 2023 at least. So it's going to be a long journey for developing countries to fully recover from the pandemic. So thanks, I'll leave it there for now.
And Professor Song.
Yes, I guess I'll share the screen. So thanks for hosting this, and it's a really interesting and very timely kind of discussion. Last semester, no, not last semester, last year, in the spring semester, I was teaching Chinese economy, and in my class, I have students present a news article in the first 3 minutes of each class. And so at the beginning of the semester, you can imagine it was about China having an outbreak of COVID-19. And it was all about just, it's all their trouble. And the only thing that we care about is the disruption of global supply chain, which interrupted a lot of trade and causing a lot of issues. Which then very quickly it turned around. In March, we had to all go home and then spend the rest of the semester remotely. But if you look at this comparison between case numbers between China and the US, you'll see that up until March, there's essentially no case in the US. But very quickly, the number just exponentially increased. Whereas in China, the number has been controlled since February, and the new cases has been basically single digit and oftentimes zero. So China, in comparison to the US, had a very, very strict lockdown. Not only in terms of controlling the outbreak city, but also in terms of cross-border travel. It's a lot harsher than kind of what US has been implementing, but you can also argue that that's really, really draconian, and it's limiting individual freedom, and it may not be the best for the economic growth or exchange. But in terms of the case numbers, this is the comparison. And China is the only country to have a positive GDP growth among the major economy last year. So in 2020, China grew 2.3 percentage point, and US happened to be a decrease by the same number, 2.3% last year. So I'm not saying that, oh, look, China is doing great. China is actually facing a lot of issues right now, even though most of the cities have been back to normal, especially the manufacturing, which is a majority of Chinese GDP, kind of in terms of GDP by primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. Its service sector hasn't been recovering as well. And that also is part of the reason why in the United States is a little bit harder to recover, because a lot of the GDP composition is contributed by the service sector in the US, and it's harder to recover. I guess one final point I'll make before we get to the discussions is the role of media. So at the very beginning, as we know, in China, there's censorship and there's state control of media. One of the reasons why China couldn't control the outbreak earlier was because the local government suppressed the media dissemination of information and suspicion of some local doctors that there may be an outbreak. Whereas later on in the US, media also played a role in the sense that spreading misinformation about coronavirus, as well as today, misinformation about vaccines. So I think it's a very interesting kind of role that media has been playing in this crisis as well. I guess I'll stop there and we can go to discussions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, all of our panelists. This was interesting. I feel like when we start to unpack COVID and the economy, there's so much. And I think all of our panelists touched on some very wide and diverse areas. And so I think to start out the first question, when we start to view COVID pandemic as this sort of this intro econ framework, right? We start to view it as an exogenous shock. The question becomes, well, should we view it as an exogenous demand shock, a supply shock, or some form of both, right? And do you feel like you had some intuition of what the COVID shock might look like in terms of demand supply shock? And has that changed have like after you've seen the pandemic evolve? This question is open for the panel.
So I can jump in first, I guess. So I guess my first thought was that it was a supply shock, and that was the first thing that I thought when I heard about it, and it's become clear to me that that was not the right way to think about it, because if you look at what's happened with prices, we have So a supply shock, if it was solely a supply shock, we would expect to see inflation increasing instead of decreasing, which is what we've observed. And so I think, you know, the things that I missed when I first thought about it were that I hadn't really thought about how much it would change consumption behavior. And I think that, you know, part of it was we have these lockdowns that's going to cause us to have there be issues with supply. But, you know, there's also the issue with you can't go and buy things. And so that's clearly a demand shock. And then I think that a lot of that I expected people to return to more normal behavior quickly than they have. And so I guess I underestimated just how much people would internalize the risks of things. And so I think that that's, you know, it's in the textbook, it's really easy to think supply versus demand, but there's clearly linkages between the two when it comes to actual behavior. But you know, it's become clear to me that I would say it's been predominantly demand shock, but there's a huge supply shock as well.
See, my perspective, this is kind of like the mother of all supply shocks from my perspective here. Like, I agree with some of what Rich was saying there about, you know, the inability to go out and buy things that you would want to buy. That's like a demand shock right there. But from the perspective of the production structure of the economy, like production is about people getting together, doing things together, and the kind of requirements for social physical distancing and various lockdowns, to me, just put so much of it's so much of an interruption to the way that people were doing things. That's the part that to me seems really more significant. I think the interpretation of the data on inflation, I think, is a little tricky in some ways, because what do you think about the prices of products that you can't buy at all, right? I think that's something that I guess I'm not sure exactly how to think about. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
Excellent. That's anybody else want to add to the conversation? So I want to switch gears a little bit and kind of drill in on what Professor Song was saying in regards to China. So I wonder if you could just, maybe not the whole audience has a good in-depth knowledge of how China responded to the COVID pandemic from a fiscal and monetary perspective. Can you provide a bit of overview of how they responded, and then maybe compare and contrast that to the United States? And then if you know, if you still have time and you want to expand further, what are some of the long-term implications of China's plan, and how that might be different from the US as well?
Sure. I mean, I have to first give a disclaimer that I'm not sure what I know is the complete picture, but from what I have read and heard, basically, I think China's response to the pandemic, the biggest difference is not in terms of fiscal or monetary. It's in how they control the pandemic itself. Because now since last fall, China, most my friends and family's lives in different cities have been basically back to normal. There's no more social distancing. I mean, some people still wear masks, but most people don't anymore. And in the national holiday, the touristy places get crowded again, and so I think the containment of the pandemic itself probably play the biggest role in the economic recovery. But coming back to the fiscal and monetary policy, so China also reduced their rates and cut down the reserve ratio and, you know, the expansionary monetary policy. But so far as I know, I don't think they are doing as much of a expansionary policy and giving a lot of big promises as the Fed is doing. And similarly, fiscal policy and response is not as not as large as the US. So, and the format they adopted was also different. They were targeting more on the supply side, on the firm side. So they have a lot of subsidies towards small and medium-sized firms and tax relief, which the United States also have, the Paycheck Protection Program. But China did not send stimulus checks to everyone. Some small cities experimented with kind of spending vouchers, which is basically to discourage people to save, kind of going back to Dean's picture of how the savings rate goes up so much. They don't want people to save it, they want people to spend it. So I guess that's kind of an interesting difference between giving people fungible money versus vouchers to stimulate consumption. And I guess the final question in terms of long-term effects, I feel like COVID recovery will eventually be there for most countries, including US and Europe, now that the vaccine is really rapidly getting done, especially in the US, very successfully. But I think what's more uncertain is the deglobalization triggered by COVID, in the sense that all the firms are now more aware of the risks to be exposed to spreading your supply chain too far away, as well as the China-US kind of geopolitical tension.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Song, for your response. This is a good time to mention that all of the people in the audience, please send in your question and answer. We hope to move to Q&A right after this one question. And so what I wanted to ask for the panel today is like, so one, we've seen sort of like fiscal policy, particularly in the US, there have been like some sort of time delays, whether that's with the passing of the stimulus bill. And so I think on the first part of the question, what has that cost us, if anything, those delays in investment? And on the second part of the question, Professor Murphy, right, one of the very interesting things he brings up is sort of this divide in sort of like fiscal assistance in developing countries versus developed, right? I.e. this idea, it's different being poor in a developing country versus being poor in the US, right? And so is there any solutions you identify for developing countries, particularly in terms of fiscal assistance? Yeah, feel free to jump in.
Maybe I'll add maybe something to this second question that so it's not exactly answering your question, but the fiscal assistance has been obviously a much larger shock absorber in developed countries than in developing countries. But one thing that's partly played the type of role that fiscal assistance would in developed countries, in a lot of developing countries, is just the fact that there is still a relatively large agricultural sector. So a lot of people working in cities where things have shut down. They've gone back to a lot of rural urban migrations. A lot of people moved back to their rural villages, for example, and this has been kind of a relatively large shock absorber in many countries, just because it can be the difference between, at least having some subsistence level of consumption versus having completely cut off from any source of income and consumption. So it's seen kind of this large migration from urban areas to rural areas in a lot of countries, which also been a challenge from a COVID perspective because it sort of spreads COVID more widely. But I think that's been kind of an important lifeline in a lot of countries.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So that's true. So that the fact that rural areas in that sense do serve as some kind of shock absorber. But I guess something to also think about is there's a lot of complexities to life in rural areas in developing countries. And actually, most households in rural areas are not just farming. They actually have a diversity of incomes. So when this economic crisis has happened in many developing countries, a lot of those agricultural households who do have a diversity of incomes have lost one or more of those sources of incomes. And not only that, they're also oftentimes net buyers of food. Even though they're agricultural producers, they tend to be net buyers. And given that markets are not very well integrated in many of these countries, what has happened is the prices of certain goods, and in some cases food, has increased a lot, especially because of that lack of integration. So I guess my point is that everything is complex in developing countries, and especially in rural areas in developing countries. And while it is true that a lot of households do have that source to fall back on, it's that there's still going to be a significant negative shock to most households as a result. And like I mentioned earlier, there is not, or there is much less of a fiscal support from the government for these households. So it's challenging. I like that.
I'd like to add something too, a little just from the kind of perspective of developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
That a big thing here is vaccines and vaccine rollout, right? I mean, I think for the United States, for European countries, the biggest thing that's going to get everybody back to normal, the economy, the society generally back to normal, is mass vaccination and the herd immunity that comes with that, right? And that's proceeding pretty well in the United States at this point. But it's way behind in a lot of countries, especially a lot of developing countries, right? And a lot of that is some of these vaccines are kind of on the expensive side, and if you're a poorer country, maybe it seems like a tough thing to do to lay out a lot of money up front for some of these vaccines. On top of that, there's the some of the mRNA vaccines, right? The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which require super cold storage. They're just difficult to distribute in tropical areas and rural areas in tropical countries, especially. And so I think for those countries, my perspective is more than anything, for the United States as well, more than anything that gets us back to normal is vaccinations. And so it's a matter of more and more vaccines being developed that can be stored in a refrigerator and transported around relatively easily. So I think that's a pretty big deal as well, I think.
Yeah, and I agree. And also the fact that Pfizer and Moderna, even if they were to be distributed in developing countries, requires the 2 shots. So logistically, that's challenging as well. And another thing I'll just add is that a lot of developing countries are doing certain policies that we haven't seen in the United States or many developed countries, where they're limiting geographic movement within countries. And when we're talking about internal migration, so if there's someone who lives in the city and their family has a farm, if a country is a farm in a rural area, if a country is putting in these geographic limits on movement, then that could prohibit people from moving back to be with their family as well. So that's a challenge, and what we see oftentimes that is really common in developing countries is there are 1 or 2 members of every household who may be working in a larger city, and the freedom of movement does not necessarily exist in some of these countries like they would say in the United States. So adding another challenging aspect.
Awesome. No, that was very insightful discussion. So I wanted to move on to the next question we have from someone in the audience. So Raluca from the audience asks, do you think the COVID crisis has significantly changed the way individuals invest their money? This question is open to the entire panel.
There's definitely a sharp increase in individual investors and a lot more speculation in the stock market since the pandemic. I think that it's my personal view, but I think the stock market is there's definitely a bubble. It's not for all companies. Like some tech companies indeed benefited from the COVID, and their growth warrant their stock price increase. But at the same time, there are just a lot of other companies where the stock is completely detached from what is really going on.
You wouldn't be talking about GameStop there, would you? So yeah, I guess I would say that it's hard to say. There certainly have been a lot of changes. So I think that part of it is there are people that just have more time on their hands than they would otherwise. And so, you know, why not invest $100 in GameStop when you hear everyone talking about it? But I think a deeper level, you know, the rules of the game have changed for a lot of companies. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of good reasons to not be investing in a Carnival Cruises or Norwegian Cruises or Delta Air or United. And so, you know, Amazon looks pretty good because everyone's going to be able to buy their Amazon, whatever they get on Amazon, no matter what's going on with COVID. And so I think that there are changes, but I think that, you know, part of it is people have more spare time and they also have this money that they aren't spending elsewhere. And so, you know, buying shares of GameStop or something like that almost replaces going out and consuming something by going to the movies or something like that. It provides some entertainment for people that are bored. And so, you know, I think there's some of that. And then I think some of it is just the economy looks quite different. And so that's going to lead to people investing in different sectors. And then, you know, the stock market in general has definitely been a huge beneficiary of the Federal Reserve's monetary policy and, you know, each round of fiscal stimulus.
Another dimension of investment here is residential investment. So some people at least have been putting a lot of money into housing, sort of expanding an existing home or buying up more property. You know, I think for people who are spending a lot of time in their house, it seems like it's a good thing to invest in. So that's I think one thing. And the other thing that to me seems plausible as a longer term kind of effect here is an influence on people's precautionary instincts, right? I mean, the COVID caught us all unawares. This is a big shock. And you know, the governments around the world have done what they can to kind of cushion that blow, but it's not a you know, perfect shock absorber the government provides for everybody. And so I think for a lot of people there'll be this instinct potentially to have a bit more of a kind of a buffer stock of saving in case some kind of a disaster befalls them. So that's a plausible thing. So it might mean at least some amount of investment in safer kinds of assets that are easy to withdraw your funds from if you need them. But by the way, so this is my academic speculation at this point, right? I don't have any data to support this. So that's the only kind of speculation I tend to engage in.
All right, I think we'll move on to the next question. This one comes from Richard, and Richard wants to know, he's seen a substantial jump in the M2 money supply following a large amounts of quantitative easing, really growing 25%, more than 25% in the year. And he's also seeing that the velocity of money is decreasing. So given these circumstances, do you see that there's going to be a possible runaway inflation, or is this not much of a concern for the next few years of the economy? And yeah.
I guess I'll jump in and say that when I think about answering that question, I'm not really thinking too much about either M2 or velocity, but I think back to what Professor Scrimgeour had in the slides, essentially with that really savings rate over the past year, and thinking if when people get vaccinated, is there going to be this sort of run out to consume with all of that savings, or are people going to just sort of return to normal levels of consumption? And I guess not quite clear in my mind what's going to end up happening. And so, we saw with quantitative easing last time that we had this big increase in the money supply, velocity fell and it remained low, and we just never saw the inflation that people worried about. And so I'm not so much concerned about the money supply because the Fed can control interest rates, but the changes in consumption that might come out of this, I guess, are what I would think about more when thinking about the potential for higher inflation.
I guess one follow-up question to that is, looking at the guidance the Fed is offering, do you see that they are looking at a situation where people do go out and consume, or are they in a camp where they don't see this as much of an impending concern? And if there is kind of in the camp of they're seeing going to be a large growth in consumption, what sort of tools might the Fed have to implement to make sure the economy doesn't see the large inflation?
I'll just add a little bit on this inflation in response to this. I think, I agree with Rich that in a sense, this expansion of the money supply just feels exactly like what we saw 10 years ago after the Great Recession. And it was basically the Fed was swapping one kind of essentially risk-free asset for a different kind of risk-free asset, but it wasn't having a huge influence on how much people were spending. There's some influence, but it wasn't like, oh, if we doubled the money supply, we're going to get price levels doubling, just like you would normally expect out of the quantity theory of money or something, right? So I think from the Fed's perspective, a little bit extra inflation, or people expecting a little extra inflation, is like just fine for right now, in the sense that the higher expected inflation brings down the real interest rates that people face. I think there's an important quantitative question about what levels of inflation we might be expecting and what we would be sort of scared of. I'd be surprised if there was much more than 5% inflation in any year over the next 10 years, I think. And I think that when people talk about like what scary levels of inflation might be, like for the United States, a scary level might be persistent inflation at 20% per year, but even that's at some level manageable. And we're not going to sort of jump there overnight. It's going to be gradual if we get there, and the Fed has plenty of chance to hit that off before we really get to that level, I would think. So I think the Fed will have plenty of opportunity to tell people, this inflation is going up and we're on it, and we're going to kind of make sure it doesn't get out of control. That's my expectation.
And I'd add that with the Fed's flexible average inflation targeting that they implemented last year, that they would certainly welcome higher inflation for the reason of lowering the real interest rate, but also trying to get the average inflation back up to 2% to make that 2% inflation target a little bit more credible, since inflation consistently ran below that. And so, I think what would happen is if we saw inflation getting probably above 2.5%, but definitely if it got above 3%, that the Fed would start to raise rates. The first thing would be tapering the purchasing of assets, and with their quantitative easing, and then it would be raising rates through this mechanisms that they did before, raising interest on reserves and the on RRP rate. But I think that, I agree that, it would be unlikely that get very high very quickly. I think the Fed would have room to act. The downside would be that if they have to raise interest rates, that is potentially going to cut down on business investment, and that could potentially hamper having sort of a long sustained recovery.
Awesome. I think the next questions, Maximilian and Christina, they basically allow us to change gears and talk about the other side of policy, right? So fiscal policy. And one of the interesting things they bring up is sort of like this huge amount of fiscal stimulus we are seeing right now in terms of the bill being passed, besides all of the monetary stimulus that is happening via the Fed. Do you guys identify any problems or any downsides to it? And so one of the ones that we talked about is inflation, but do you think on a micro level, it could interfere with markets working effectively independently? Maybe the negative downsides get accelerated with the economic recovery. Like, is there any reason to be worried with all this stimulus?
My fear would be just what I said, that if the economy recovered sort of too quickly, in a sense, that the Fed could be forced to raise interest rates, and that could crowd out private investment. I think that it's something that, to go back to what Professor Scrimgeour said near the beginning of the panel, that we're fighting the last battle, essentially, with our fiscal and monetary policy. That we learned our lessons from the Great Recession, that you want to be aggressive with monetary and fiscal policy right away. And I think that the potential downsides to that, where the economy might recover a little too quickly and inflation might get high, those are problems that the Fed has a lot of, they have a lot of confidence that they can control that. Whereas if the economic recovery is slow, like it was the last time, that fiscal and monetary authorities don't have a lot of confidence that they can sort of boost that economic growth.
So I'm not a macroeconomist, but I'll just give my 2 cents here. Or just like point out something that hasn't been talked about, and that's that the United States nowadays is very integrated into the international economic environment. So really, when we have fiscal stimulus like we have now in the United States, in a sense, we're exporting the stimulus as well. So, and just to tie this into my specialty, is anecdotally what I'm hearing is anybody who has relatives in other countries, they get the stimulus money and then they're sending a bunch of it overseas to their family who live in other countries. So, I mean, how large of a share of the stimulus is that? Probably very small. But I mean, but it just goes to show that, we're not a self-contained country economically. And a lot of this money is going to be spent on imports and is going to leak abroad in one way or another. So I think that's just another reason why I personally am not, and again, I'm not a macroeconomist, but I'm personally not that worried about inflation from the current stimulus. I don't know, maybe a macroeconomist can correct me if I'm wrong. But.
Awesome. So I guess we're very short in time, so we wanted to end with one question for the entire panel. Maybe we can go around the panel and answer this question. COVID has been hard on all of us, and I'm sure we're all looking for optimism at one point. And so, looking at the COVID economic recovery going forward, what is one thing that gives you optimism, either about economic recovery in the US, developing countries, or the rest of the world? Just so we can sign this panel on a positive note.
I could go first on this one. So before anyone takes this answer, but probably the vaccines more than anything else. And I think one thing that we got unlucky with a lot of stuff about COVID, but one thing we got lucky about is that vaccines actually work against this thing, and we have many vaccines, and I think that over time, as the production rises to scale for all the vaccines, that I think really is the major hope, and hopefully it goes fast enough that we don't get something like a new variant. Oh, it's supposed to be positive, but we don't get a new variant that undermines the vaccine. But the vaccines, I think, are the thing to look forward to.
Professor Song, you wanna go?
Rishi sort of took my took my point that I was gonna say. I already feel that a lot of us at Colgate are getting vaccinated, and we already have the plan for the fall semester. I know you guys are Matt is graduating, but Sahil, those of you who are juniors and sophomores, you'll be able to come back and we'll all have in-person classes if everything goes well. I see that there's a lot of hope that by the third quarter of this year, in the US at least, things will be getting back to normal. And I think it's a very extreme year last year, and I look forward to having more normalcy back.
Okay, so we don't have an environmentalist on the panel, so I'll just say something about the environment, I guess. But so one positive or silver lining of the pandemic is that the lockdowns created a large decrease in carbon emissions. And actually in developing countries, what happened is where there's typically very bad air pollution, for instance, they had some of the cleanest days, air quality days, that they've experienced in a generation. So what that demonstrated to people is, it reminded them of the benefits of a clean environment. And I think it has pushed a lot of people, both in developing and developed countries, to kind of redouble efforts towards addressing climate change and other negative environmental effects.
Professor Higgins?
I guess I would add one a positive note that with vaccines and CDC guidelines that just came out, it looks positive that a lot of schools, not just colleges, will be in person. And one of the things that we saw this past fall was that labor force participation rates for women were disproportionately affected by essentially the start of the school year and schools being remote. And so, there's some hope that we can maybe reverse that trend if we can have kids back in school, which would help economic activity and should boost productivity.
Rishi did take my one. So I'll just kind of build on what Rishi was saying, right? The vaccines have been incredible, it seems. And I think I think there's a kind of a demonstration effect in that gives me a lot of hope. Lots of things have, gone poorly, sometimes policy-wise, sometimes otherwise during the pandemic. But the development of vaccines, safe and effective vaccines, has been really amazing in terms of how quick that's happened. And I guess to me, the hopeful side of that, beyond just, like vaccines might end this thing for us, is that we have a problem and people working together are able to come up with solutions for that problem. And it's not just the vaccines that are like that, but even just figuring out how to have classes when we're not face to face in front of each other. I guess those are things that a lot of people already knew, but I had no idea about that, a year ago. And so there's a lot of problems that we've solved over this last year, big problems and small problems. And there's a lot of ways in which we've changed and adjusted to the pandemic world. And so for me, the hopeful side of that is, we have other problems. And I hope that, we'll be able to tackle those other problems. The solutions to the problems in the pandemic in terms of the vaccines, for example, built on a lot of developments that have taken place over previous years. So, maybe various innovations and scientific investigations that we get ongoing will lead to solutions to future problems we haven't even heard of yet. And I think that's just I think something to be optimistic about, is our ability to address problems and solve problems. We've been doing it. It's not always perfect, but we can get it done. So that's my optimism.
Thank you, Professor. That's a really nice note to end on, and definitely very collaborative and forward-looking into a good recovery from the COVID pandemic. With that said, I want to give a huge round of applause virtually to all of our panelists taking the time out tonight to chat with us. This was an enormously informative conversation, and thank you everybody who joined the call to listen in. Sahil, anything you'd like to add?
No, I just wanted to add, I think we are having that phase where things are getting busier. And I think the moment things get busy for students, it gets 10 times busier for faculty, because grading is much harder than actually taking the exams. And so again, thank you so much for taking the time out. Thank you also to all of the audience members who joined in virtually. I'm sure all of us took away something valuable out of this session. So thank you so much again for joining us.